The Trumpet Daily from Jerusalem.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. In the lead up to Hurricane Sandy, meteorologists were calling it the perfect storm. The storm of the century, some said. And given the size and scope of that storm, can you imagine the major media just turning a blind eye to those many warnings and deciding to simply ignore the story altogether? Well, as difficult as that might be to imagine with respect to the storm, it has happened with respect to the Benghazi attack. When you consider the size and the scope of that terrorist attack, and then the shameful cover-up that followed, the media has essentially blacked it out. There are a few exceptions, mostly in the conservative circles, but for the most part, the major media has simply ignored the story. At least they've ignored the most scandalous part of this story. Now, it's been almost 2 months since the terrorist attack on Benghazi that resulted in the murder of a U.S. ambassador and 3 other Americans. And early on, you'll remember, the Obama administration tried to blame the attack on a violent reaction to that YouTube video. For nearly 2 weeks, in fact, administration officials insisted that this was not a premeditated attack. And it's not hard to see why. At the Democratic National Convention, which took place on September the 6th, President Obama had this to say.
You know, in a world of new threats and new challenges, you can choose leadership that has been tested and proven. 4 years ago, I promised to end the war in Iraq. We did. I promised to refocus on the terrorists who actually attacked us on 9/11, and we have. We've blunted the Taliban's momentum in Afghanistan, and in 2014, our longest war will be over. A new tower rises above the New York skyline. Al-Qaeda is on the path to defeat, and Osama bin Laden is dead. Tonight, we pay tribute to the Americans who still serve in harm's way. We are forever in debt to a generation whose sacrifice has made this country safer and more respected. We will never forget you. And so long as I'm Commander-in-Chief, we will sustain the strongest military the world has ever known.
Now, just 5 days after he gave that speech, Al-Qaeda attacked America's consulate in Benghazi. And then a few days after that, terrorists attacked U.S. embassies all over the world. And the strongest military the world has ever known hardly responded. And in the case of Benghazi, we now know that while the attack was going on, the State Department and the White House were getting up-to-the-minute emails about the assault. In fact, there were drones flying overhead that were filming the attack live for leaders in Washington to watch as it happened. So the Obama administration knew, while the attack was still underway, that it was a well-planned, heavily armed terrorist operation. Now, last week there was a detailed report posted on foxnews.com that said when the consulate was under attack, officers inside the CIA annex, which was just about a mile or so down the road from the consulate, they asked their superiors if they could rush to the scene to help defend the ambassador and his party. But according to this report on Fox News, they were told from the higher-ups to stand down, to not go. Now, one CIA officer actually disobeyed that command and ran to the consulate anyway, and then he later died in that firefight. According to the report, later in the night, another request for military support was also turned down. Here's just a few excerpts from that foxnews.com report. The fighting at the CIA annex went on for more than 4 hours, enough time for any planes based in Sigonella Air Base, just 480 miles away, to arrive. Fox News has also learned that 2 separate Tier 1 Special Operations forces were told to wait. Among them, Delta Force operators. A Special Operations Team, or CIF, which stands for Commanders in Extremis Force, operating in Central Europe, had been moved to Sigonella, Italy, but they were never told to deploy. In fact, a Pentagon official says there were never any requests to deploy assets from outside the country. A second force that specializes in counterterrorism rescues was on hand at Sigonella, according to senior military and intelligence sources. According to those sources, they could have flown to Benghazi in less than 2 hours. They were the same distance to Benghazi as those that were sent from Tripoli. Spectre gunships are commonly used by Special Operations community to provide close air support. And then this final paragraph says, according to sources on the ground during the attack, the special operator on the roof of the CIA annex had visual contact and a laser pointing at the Libyan mortar team that was targeting the CIA annex. The operators were calling in coordinates of where the Libyan forces were firing from. As I said, this report offers quite a lot of detail of what was going on, what happened that particular night, and essentially what it's saying is that nothing to speak of was done to help those Americans whose lives were in danger. 4 of them were murdered that night. Nothing was done to help them the night that it happened, and then for 2 weeks after that, the American people were fed a steady diet of blatant lies. And since then, well, for 5 or 6 weeks now, there's been an obvious cover-up, both by the administration and by the major media. Now, so far as I know, just in reading that Fox News report last week, no other major media sources picked up on that and gave it the kind of coverage that you would expect. I mean, think about the details. Think about those charges. I mean, these are devastating charges. And yet none of the mainstream outlets seem that interested in this devastating set of claims. And it's been trickling out of Benghazi over the past 2 months, as I said, just by a few media sources. Now you look at what's happening in the United States, and of course, as you would expect, the U.S. media is going to be giving wall-to-wall coverage of the after effects of the hurricane that hit the Northeast. But when you see that extensive coverage, just think about how this Benghazi attack should have been covered from the very beginning, given the size and the scope of this spectacular failure in foreign policy and just about every other angle of this story. It's a sickening scandal and an electoral game changer, but only in a sane universe, Melanie Phillips wrote recently. Let me give you some other quotes. This is from Thomas Sowell's latest column, October the 29th. He said, from the time it took office, the Obama administration has sought to suppress the very concept of a war on terror or the terrorist war on us. He says the painful farce of calling the Fort Hood murders workplace violence instead of a terrorist attack in our midst shows how far the Obama administration would go to downplay the dangers of Islamic extremist terrorism. He writes, the killing of Osama bin Laden fed the pretense that the terrorism threat had been beaten. But the terrorist attack in Libya exposed that fraud and required another fraud to try to cool out the voters until after Election Day. Now, you think about these events, not just the one in Benghazi, but all over the world. There were reports last week of Israel perhaps striking that factory in the Sudan, and now Iran's getting involved into this conflict in Eastern Africa. You have this spectacular failure in Benghazi, exposing really the flaws, the fatal flaws of the Obama administration's foreign policy. And then this massive storm coming up to the Northeast, just days before the election. World events are happening so fast. Let me just read you a couple of verses before we conclude. This is Luke 21 and verse 34. Jesus said, "And take heed to yourselves, lest at any time your hearts be overcharged with surfeiting and drunkenness, and the cares of this life, and so that day come upon you unawares." He was saying now is not the time to get caught up in materialism. Here we are right at the end, the latter days. And so many people are just oblivious to what's happening in this world. So many people don't care that huge stories receive such little coverage. Verse 35 says, "For as a snare shall it come on all them that dwell on the face of the whole earth. Watch you therefore," verse 36 says, "and pray always that you may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass and to stand before the Son of Man." Jesus said to watch and to pray. I mean, that is an admonition that we need for our day. Today, we're living right here in the very last days. And as I said earlier, you see all of these events just swirling about us here in the Middle East, in Eastern Africa, the elections coming up in the United States, the rising imperialist power in Europe. This is the time we had better be not just watching, as Jesus said there, but praying as well. Now you can log on to thetrumpet.com and stay informed about what's happening in this world and have God shed light on the meaning behind these many events. That's thetrumpet.com. And of course, stay tuned in with us as well here at the Trumpet Daily. This is Stephen Flurry reporting to you from Jerusalem, and we'll see you next time.